It's January 17, 2025. I'm Gloria Nussbaum, and I'm talking with Abe Ens of Winkler, Manitoba, Canada, via Zoom about his involvement with Mennonite Disaster Service. Abe, I'm delighted that we finally were able to make this connection, and I look forward to hearing what you have to share with us. We start at the beginning. Can you tell me when and where you first learned about Mennonite Disaster Service?
It was in 1950 when the Red River of the North flood came. I happened to be visiting with some of my friends, and all of a sudden their father came out to us and said, "Boys, I think it's time to go to bed. Tomorrow morning you will take the 2 trucks to Low Farm to pick up cattle out of the flood area." That was in 1950.
And about how old were you at that point?
I must have been between 18 and 19. I'm born in 31.
1931.
Yeah, I've seen a few sunsets.
So what actually motivated you to get involved? I'm guessing, did you hear about this through your church, or what was your motivation?
Certainly through the church, but also we had been following what MDS was doing. MDS was actually born in 1950 in Chicago. At the same time in Manitoba, although they didn't know about us, we were north of the 49th. And then I was appointed congregational contact person, and I held that position for over 30 years. Then I was elected to the Manitoba MDS board and became chairman of it. All of Canada constituted Region 5. And when I became chairman of MDS Manitoba board, then I was elected to chairman of MDS Region 5 and automatically became a board member on the binational board.
So when you got involved in MDS, you went in all the way.
Yes, sort of. One of my first experiences at the binational board meeting was that I wanted to see where the MDS office was, and they had rented a space in MCC East. It was approximately 100 square feet, and they told me they were always glad when the secretary or the executive director left the room, so they had more elbow room in that room.
And this was part of a building in Akron, Pennsylvania?
Akron, Pennsylvania, that's right. Of course, we had all unit meetings every year, and all the regional directors had to give reports what happened in their region. And that started before my time. And Eddie Beringer of Ontario was Region 5 director a number of years before I was. And MDS always joked about Canada being the Great White North. And when Eddie Beringer came to those meetings, they nicknamed him the Great White Bear.
It is interesting that all of Canada is one region, and it still is, right? It's Region 5 still?
Yes, it's still Region 5.
Talk a bit about what it's like to be the head of such geographically, I mean, that's thousands and thousands of miles. How do you work at that?
Well, I've been only as far as east as the Atlantic provinces. I haven't been to Newfoundland. But one of the interesting things was that Quebec was also wanted to be part of this, and that's French territory. Their main language is French, but they had a dam break on the Saguenay River at that time, and so I went up there to see what we could do. By then I was regional director, and they told us stories of what had happened. The Saguenay River comes from the north flowing to the south, And the river had originally divided into 5 streams at the mouth of the river, but they had narrowed it down to 3. And when this flood water came down, it went back to all 5 streams and washed the credit union into the St. Lawrence River, including the concrete vault. And then they wanted to know what we could do to help. And he says, do you build bridges? I said, no, we don't have engineers. Well, then we don't know what we can do. But then they started talking about maybe collecting some goods for the people that were flooded out. And I said, and be careful what you ask for, because you will create a second disaster if you don't do that. So I get a phone call from our Quebec representative one time, and he said, we have a Christian, what they call a Christian family, not a Catholic family. They would like to go and serve in some fashion. Would we be willing to pay their gasoline expenses? I said, yes, on one condition, that you will give me a report how it went, because they would be staying at a family from a different faith persuasion. And so it was interesting. Back to the binational meeting, that one time the MCC representative came to our meeting and said, we want you to separate from us because you can be a liability to us. So we said, okay, if you want to get rid of us, write up the new bylaws. And what they did is they still kept one member on the board. Well, not wanting to be too presumptuous, we figured maybe Canada should do the same thing. So we had our bylaws changed to match the binational bylaws. And a number of years later, I had been very suspicious of whether we were separate or not. And so I talked to a few other members, and they had the same feeling. So they said, we will have to hire a lawyer to go through our bylaws and see whether we are separate or not.
Just to clarify,
we're talking about separating MDS and MCC. Then I said, I don't think it'll cost us anything to find that out. On this project, we have a retired lawyer, and I will approach him and tell him, since you're doing voluntary work, can you go through our bylaws and see if we're separated? Next day he came back and he said, no way are you separated. As long as they have a board member, you are not separated. We said, then write it up so we are separated. And we did the same thing in Canada so that we would be sure that we wouldn't run into problems.
So you were there when all of this happened, and you helped to make it happen.
A lot of other things. So when we separated in Canada, I was Region 5 director at that time. I had served 4 years, and 5 years was the maximum term. But the new bylaws said it. We have 5-year terms. I said, well, then I have 1 year to go. And the secretary says, no way. You are starting now. And so I was regional director for 9 years, which was very exceptional. I enjoyed it. And because I live in Manitoba, I helped the Manitoba unit write an MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, with our Emergency Measures Organization. And I suggested that we have an 800 number, toll-free number from across Canada. In hindsight, it might have been a good idea and might not have been a good idea, because when the 97 Red River flood came, that phone almost rang off the hook. I'll talk a little bit more about the 97 flood later.
Just to clarify, you did go ahead and get that 800 numbers. At that point, it would be long distance phone charges if you didn't have an 800 number. Is that correct? And that would be one of the reasons with your huge region to have that?
But when I was on the MDS binational board, I was put on the search committee for an executive director in, I think it was 1999, when Lowell Dadwater wanted to retire. I was on that search committee. And when we had narrowed it down to 2 candidates that we were going to interview, they decided we should meet in a hotel in Chicago because that was a stopover for any flight that I had to take. So when I got to the airport, I wanted to have a taxi to go to the hotel. And we walked out of the airport and to a taxi. That's the taxi you take. So I went in there and says, where do you want to go? And I told him. He says, I'm sorry, I don't know where that is. I'll get you a different taxi. To that car, you're going with that man. Okay. Well, he says, I don't know where it is. So he sort of explained to him, and I got part of it. He says, I still don't know where to go. He says, well, I recall saying something about a certain street. Okay, he says, then we'll go. But before he started going, he bowed his head and said, good Lord, help us. And so we started driving. All of a sudden said, here's that street you mentioned. He turned on there. Sure, we were right in front of the hotel. And as he stopped, bowed his head and said, thank you. And I walked in and I never saw that guy again. But anyway, we had 2 candidates that we were interviewing. And we interviewed one of them. And the next day we would interview the second one. Well, we were partway through the first interview when the candidate said, and how much are you paying? Well, I was just a listener of the committee. I didn't ask questions or give answers. So they explained to him and we finished the interview. Next morning was an interview for the second candidate, which happened to be Tom Smucker. We interviewed Tom Smucker. Interview went very well. And when we finished the interview, the chair said, any other questions? No questions. Well, we haven't talked about remuneration. And Tom says, that's totally beside the point. What? Yeah, that's what we said. I know for a fact that it will be less that I'm making on my farm. He was one of the top 10 poultry producers in the state. But he says, whatever you give me, I'll accept it. I'll be happy with that. So that led me to Thompson. And he was a guy that he and I somehow or other thought very much the same, a lot of things. We had been appointed previously to a committee of 3 when each of us should make projections of where we saw MDS in 5 or 10 years. And Tom, before the meeting, he asked me, can I see your... I said, sure, there's no secrets. And he looked at it and he says, when did you look over my shoulder? I said, I didn't even know you before I came here. Anyway.
So when he became the executive director, the 2 of you had some history together.
Yeah, a bit of history together. And he would occasionally send me a short email, got to talk. Then I phoned him up. He says, well, why do we have to talk? We think the same. Anyway, during his tenure, he said, you know what? I think Canada deserves an office, but they will have to ask the binational meeting whether they can have an office. Okay, by that time, Eldon King was board chair, and he said, we want to come to your Region 5 annual meeting. We will both come, but we will come 2 days ahead of it, and we want to visit the provinces where we are not quite sure how they feel about this. said, fine, I have no problem with that. Next to Manitoba, Saskatchewan, we visited with them, and they were sort of lukewarm toward the idea. We knew Ontario was with us, and I knew Manitoba was with us. So the next day we flew to British Columbia, and we visited with them. And as we are on our way back, Tom says to me, this is going nowhere. Our meeting was in Alberta. Next morning at breakfast, he said, Abe, I'm glad this is your baby, not mine. I said, don't worry about it. I think we will get where we want to go. So next morning he says, okay, I called the meeting to order. We had our invocation for the meeting, and I said, gentlemen, we have one question that needs to be answered before we start the meeting. And what is your question, they said? I said, our question is, does MDS want an office in Manitoba? I didn't say Manitoba. That was being too presumptuous. So we talked a little bit about that, and all of a sudden somebody says, now tell us, what do you really want? I says, I want a motion from Region 5 to request an office in Winnipeg. And I forgot who it was who said, I moved that motion. And my good friend from Manitoba says, I second the motion. And I call for the question. I says, John, you're out of order. If you second the motion, you cannot call for the question.
He was following Robert's rules of order.
Yes. And then talking about various things, I said, fellows, we have not adopted this resolution. We first have to adopt the resolution before we go to anything else. Well, to my surprise, the vote was unanimous.
The vote of the binational board.
Yeah. And then the secretary, who was quite a bit older than I was, sitting beside me, says, Abe, what do I put in the minutes? I said, just what you heard. You know what the motion was. You know what the vote was. Okay. I said, Tom, now it's your baby. We had a good discussion, and we settled most of the things there.
Did you have an idea of an actual space that might be available, or what did you have in mind, if anything?
We didn't have anything in mind because we didn't know which of the 5 provinces would want something like that. So that was discussed, and finally somebody says, well, I think it should be in Winnipeg. Do we have a motion for that? Yes. Second, yes. Unanimously, yes. How are we going to pay for that? I said, I have no idea. And somebody says, well, I would suggest that Gordon Friesen and Abe Ens put together a plan and bring it to the next annual meeting. Okay, we did. And when we got there, finally, it was a bit of a convoluted answer because somehow or other, one of the provinces always seemed to be a little bit of a, whatever you want to call it. I call it Republican.
Maybe a stickler?
So we came up with a plan at our next Region 5 annual meeting. It was accepted, and MCC Canada, MCC Manitoba were there too, and they wanted us to have a meeting here, but their whole building was what I called in farm language freestyle housing. There was open area, there were no walls separating them. We said, no way, it will be an enclosed office. We can't do it. Well, I said, then forget us, then we'll find something else. Well, it didn't take long. They said, yeah, we'll agree. And we didn't have a big office. But I said, we want an office that we can totally enclose the door. We can have private discussions here. And later on, we found that we had really been a thorn in their side because their employees all wanted closed offices. Well, that was not my problem. The long and short of it was we hired a young graduate from the disaster management school to be our first, what we call them, extension director, and it worked fine.
Let me just clarify. So what you eventually ended up with, at least for your first office, was an enclosed office with real walls and a door at the MCC Canada/Manitoba office building. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. And the MCC Manitoba director, I knew him from before, and he could be, I don't know what to call it, but
challenging?
And our project director for the Red River flood, which happened during that time, was also one who, well, I said, like a bull in a china shop. Now we had two bulls in the china shop. And all of a sudden I get an email from the Secretary of Manitoba, who was also an MCC employee. Says, Abe, I think we are in deep trouble. I says, why? Well, we seemingly can't agree on those things. Well, we'll have a meeting and we'll find out how that works. We had a meeting and the problem was resolved. Also, during my tenure there, the offices in Lititz were built, and the chairman had the audacity of saying that I think we as board members should set an example of donating toward that. Something in the neighborhood of $15,000 each. Well, we all sort of shook our heads the right way, and I told them it'll take a while, but I'll get that money to you. We sort of set the tone for donations. Anyway, I don't know if all of the logistical order, but then came the Red River flood of 1997, which happened to be 65 miles long and 30 miles wide, the flood. And they had always joked at all unit meetings that all the snowstorms and so forth says, yes, our worst snowstorms are from Colorado, and I think Colorado is a state of USA. Yes. Well, then when the snow melts, you send us the liquid acids north. Anyway.
And what was the response?
Well, I sometimes got a lot of applause for people who felt a little like that, like me. So when this flood happened, the executive director of MCC Manitoba one day phoned me. I wasn't on the Manitoba board or anything. Phoned me and says, Abe, what is MDS doing? I says, well, I'm not on the Manitoba board, so I don't know. Well, he says, we got phone calls and phone calls and phone calls, and we don't know what's going on. I said, okay, I'll use what I think authority I have and tell you to call a meeting of the Manitoba board, and I asked you to be chairman of the board. I will be at that board meeting too.
Now, is this a board of MCC or MDS?
The Manitoba board of MDS, but I asked the Manitoba MCC director to lead the meeting because I didn't want to lead the meeting. I wanted to discuss things. So he called a meeting. I told him, you can tell Kathy to notify the Manitoba board to come to a meeting. I have called a meeting of Manitoba board, even though I'm not on it. But I'm Region 5 board member. So we came together and it went back and forth over all kinds of things. And we finally agreed that it would be nice if we hire a person to man the telephone or 800 number. And somebody told us there was a MCC employee returning and he might be interested in that job. He said yes. So we talked about different things and so forth. And at the end of the meeting, this guy came to me and he said, does MDS always work like this? I said, no, only when it's necessary. He says the amount of decision that you made during this meeting would take MCC 2 months to process, and you did it in 2 hours. But anyway, we appointed a former Region 5 director who also had been a number of project directors as the project director for the response to the Red River flood. And I forget who the construction foreman was, but we had a certain Gord Friesen who announced his retirement in January. He was working for Boeing at that time. And the manager of Boeing had come to him and said, Gord, you stay here until the strike is over, and it will be well worth your time. And Gord came to us, looked at a few things that were going on. He says, that bookkeeping system you have here is archaic. I will write a computer program to keep the records. You can't have a secretary occupy a whole desk with one book and do the accounting. So he did that, but I told him, you don't have to leave yet. So he stayed with us, and he was our PR guy, wonderful human resources guy. We had lots of cleanup work to do. We had lots of volunteers. The head of the Canadian Reformed Church phoned me while I was at a meeting in Fargo, North Dakota, asking, can we work under you? I said, sir, in Christian service, we don't work under each other. We work together. I'm happy to hear that. Then Habitat for Humanity wanted to work with us too. Came to one of our meetings and says, Abe, we are having a meeting at Habitat's office. We want you there. Okay? Anyway, the long and short of it was that it worked. We have a policy that in major disasters, there's a report to the binational board on a weekly basis. So Tom Smucker came out one time and talked about it, and he says, our rules say we don't build garages, but we build sun porches. And as far as I'm concerned, the garage is more important in Canada than a sun porch in the South. Go ahead and build garages if you need them. So that was sort of broadening the rules a bit. So St. Agatha is about 20 miles south of Winnipeg, and it was really flooded. We built 3 new homes from August to December in St. Agatha. And one of them lost his business too. We helped clean up a little bit there. His wife was a school teacher, but on maternity leave. And so we had our regular house dedications when we were finished. So when we did one of the first dedications, we said to the owner, and he was the guy with the computer business, I said, invite your priest too. Father has to come too. Well, we got there. We waited and waited and waited. And finally the guy says, you guys know how to build a house? You guys know how to dedicate a house. Go ahead and do it. If that old bugger doesn't want to come, then we'll do it without him. And Gord, being the guy that he is, we asked him to do the dedication service and hand over the keys. And he said, Gord, you keep one key. You shall have full access to our house at any time you want. No building. We had 4 ladies do a lot of painting after the building was constructed. We had one that was ready for sheetrocking, and John, my friend, said, I'll see if I can get a couple of brothers to do a building together. And they do sheetrocking. Okay, fine. He got them, and they started working it. They spent 5 minutes talking to each other, and everything fit. So when the new builds were ready to paint, we had 4 ladies, including my wife, her sister, and my sister, and another lady. They painted all the houses. And they usually would start singing when they painted. One time they were singing in Spanish. At least one of them was in Spanish. The other ones, I think, sang in English. And one of the volunteers comes up and says, I hear Spanish here. I understand Spanish. I am a Spaniard. Oh, yeah, not further to building. Now, how do you build if the owners have to buy all their material, and then after they have bought the material, they have to send invoices to the Disaster Assistance Board, and that gets paid. Well, most of them have spent most of their earnings trying to prevent the flood. So Sid Reimer, who was on the board where the responding agencies met every week, and he suggested to us, what if we make an agreement with disaster assistance and the homeowner that they would issue the checks jointly to our names, as nobody could run away with the money. And disaster assistance had said, if you persuade a owner to do that, we won't stand in your way. That's a great idea. So Sid reported this at a meeting, and the Red Cross looks at him and says, when you leave this meeting, you can pick up a check at the door. Well, when Sid picked up the check, it was $250,000. And they said, we are going to monitor what you are doing. And if it meets our criteria, you might not have to repay that. Well, we talked about it and we said, well, in order to make the fund grow a little bit, we'll take all the donations from non-Mennonite churches, and we received a pretty hefty check from Steelworkers of Ontario. We'll put that in the fund so that we can have it a revolving fund. Well, it worked very well. As a matter of fact, when the response was closed in 2000, we had revolved over $3 million. So when we made the decision, somebody said, who knew something about MDS, what will binational say about that? I says, I'm on the board. Don't worry about it. At our next meeting, phone call meeting, I said, hold your chairs. We are financing rebuilds and renovations. And you could almost hear them inhale. What? I said, we're north of the 49th parallel. That's my involvement, except if you want to know something about my project director experience, I can also relate to some of that.
Give me one or two examples of the project director's work that you did.
If I remember correctly, North Carolina was the first project that I was sent to. And we had a meeting in the western part of the United States. And Tom Smucker came to me one evening and said, Abe, I want you to go to North Carolina to open the project. I don't know how. Don't worry, you'll do it. I said, I can't. I don't have any work clothes on. We came with my brother, and he says, well, that's okay. Don't worry about it. We can get you clothes. He can send them. We'll pay the postage.
So he wanted you to go directly from that meeting to North Carolina. And did you?
And it was that we were going to travel together with the Region 1 director. North Carolina was in Region 1, pulling a travel trailer behind us. So you can imagine that we spent a few days together on the road. So, of course, we started talking about when we were born, when we were married. Said, well, we were married in 56. Oh, so were we. What month? July. So we. What day? 21st. So we.
Do you remember who that was?
I forget his name.
That's amazing.
That is amazing, yes. Next morning, it was the 16th of November. He says, today is my wife's birthday. Well, isn't that interesting? It's also her son's birthday.
the things you learn about each other in MDS.
Yeah. And when we started working, we didn't have a washing machine because we were in an old lumber yard. That's where they had partitioned off rooms for employees. So I said to the regional director, Region 1, supply us with a washing machine. Well, you can go to the laundromat. It says, like fun. We're not going to the laundromat. All the people that are affected will be using the laundromat, and we don't want to waste time standing in line. Either you bring us a washing machine, or I'll go to the appliance store and buy one. Okay? He brought us a washing machine. First time the ladies wanted to use it, didn't work. I told him. Well, he says, I'll find a repairman and ask him what to do. He says, fine. Go ahead, and I'll give you the directions. Well, in the meantime, we had 2 upper state New York people with a bunch of volunteers coming to work for us. And they wanted to do some laundry. So they put the laundry in there, started water to work. So one of the ladies goes out and says, hey, come in, fix this washing machine. They came in. Whose clothes are in there? Ours. Dump them on. We got to turn the machine on the side. So did that. Have you got the cord with 2 live wires sticking out? I says, no, but you can make one. Here, cut the cord off of this travel lamp, and then you have one. So they did. They checked it out, and they found out was the valve that held the water inside the tub was slightly bent. So they said, well, we have a plier, we'll twist it. And while they were working on it, this guy phones me and says, have you got pen and paper? I'll give you instructions. He says, forget it. Why? I said, it's working already. How did you do that? I said, I didn't do it. I just gave them the stuff to do it with. So, fine. Well, opening a project, I had never done something like that before, but I've heard that you go to the first community meetings that there are and you listen. I would say 99% of the present were ladies. They talked about what this committee is going to do and so forth, even after the flood. And then toward the end of the meeting, they said, so when will we meet next? Should we wait till after Christmas? I said, ladies, I am an alien. Your customs office says I am an alien. And if you're anywhere near serious about what you want to do, you will meet next week and every week thereafter. Okay. So they formed a committee. They hired a part-time worker to sit in the office and take phone calls. So one day I wanted to meet with her because I got to be acquainted with the area. So I phoned and says, well, I'm meeting with a local guy who has been doing a lot of work on Saturdays, on Sundays, but he's bringing in his records. He's finished. He doesn't want it anymore. I said, keep him there till I come. I came there and he said, yes, I want to turn in my books. And I want to go to a carver's exhibition for a couple of days. He was a very good wood carver. So I said, please go and don't come home too soon. But when you come home, contact me. I need to talk to you. Yeah, I think that was one of my best moves I made in North Carolina, to talk to that guy. So my next stop when I went out was the building inspector, because they have to be inspected whether they're dry enough to start rebuilding. It was on the way I usually leave the town. I said, I will stop in here every time I go out because I want your take on the clients that want some help, and I want to know if they're the people to work for. And he says, well, I'm not too well. He had sleeping sickness. But he says, my secretary knows as much as I do, and she's much better looking than I am. I says, you don't have to tell me that. Okay, fine. So I did that. And I visited a number of possible clients, came to one place. They were on social assistance and disability allowance, both of them. And they told me what they had and so forth. Well, I said, I have to do a few other things yet. I'll be back sometime later. Well, a couple of days later, I came there and I said, I'm back. What? You're the first one. They all said, we'll be back. None of them came back. You're the first one. And I said, okay, what do you want to have done? They had a house with 2 big fireplaces. And we want both of those fireplaces removed. I said, does it have anything to do with the flood? Well, yes and no. I said, well, depending on what kind of volunteers I get, we might consider that. Lo and behold, this group that I was talking about before had a whole bunch of willing and able teenagers. I said, here's a chance. So I went to the owner. I said to him, have you got a dump truck? No, I have a trailer behind my car. I said, do you know of a guy who has a dump truck? Tell him to have his dump truck there. Well. I says, if you won't do it, I will. He said, I'll find a truck and I'll have a truck there. And he did. So next day, those guys started and they threw both of the chimneys and fireplaces onto the truck before lunch. I was in another meeting, and at our noon recess, this lady who was sort of what I sometimes refer to as a 4x4, short and wide, came bouncing in there. What kind of guys are you sending me? Says, what's wrong? And then you don't feed them. I said, the feeding problem is their own. They have to make their own meals in the morning before they go out. Did they do what they were supposed to do? Yes, they have both fireplaces out already. Couldn't believe that. Then they had another house that was flooded, but they rented that out to subsidize their income. So I phoned Tom, asked, what shall I do? He says, well, our sort of rule book says we don't work on rental places, but we do. You have my permission to go ahead and do that. Okay, good. So in all, it worked out very well. I could talk on a few other ones, but I want to mention one particular one. Paul Unruh from Newton, Kansas, was also on the binational board and a tremendously good listener. He heard things that were not said. And he loved his chainsaw, and he was not afraid of dogs. So there was a recluse, if you want to call it that, I think a bachelor, who had a black dog, ferocious dog. Tom walked there and said, so what do you need to have done on your house? And he told him a few things. Paul says, we'll get some volunteers to you on one condition, that you'll tie up your dog in the backyard. Okay, no problem. So when they were finished doing the work they were supposed to do, Paul went there to sign the agreement. I forget what that was called, but anyway, Paul says to him, any complaints? He looked on a little bit. He says, yes, they spoiled my dog. Paul says to him, what do you mean they spoiled my dog? Well, they usually brought some treats along, gave them to the dog, and they even built a dog house from scrap materials. I think I'll have to rename the dog, give him a new name. And Paul says, and what do you think of the church service you attended? The volunteers had asked him to come to the church service. he had come. When Paul asked him, he said, "Oh, that singing, it really warmed my heart." Back to the dog, he says. So what was his name? Hitler. And now, well, I'm not sure yet. He has changed so much. Paul told me, I think it was him that were changed more than the dog. Anyway, Paul Unruh had said to me a number of times, "I wish I could be in a project with you together." So New Orleans, when we were there, we were sent there not knowing that Paul Unruh would show up there. So Paul showed up, told me a number of things about what was going on and what they had done, and especially about the people on the bayou and the soil tests he had started making and so forth. And the third day he comes to me and says, "Goodbye." Says, "What?" "Well, I am allowed 3 days unless you invite me." He says, "I thought I had invited you. You stay here as long as you want." So it was quite an experience with the bayou people and with the engineering company. And we always had to take a boat to the bayou, to the islands, and so forth. And one day at supper time, we noticed some of the girls were watching the door in between and didn't know why. All of a sudden, two guys from the bayou came walking in, carrying a 4-foot alligator and taped his mouth shut so he wouldn't bite anybody. But Paul said, my biggest joy was that when they sort of accept me as one of their tribe members. But I say, Paul had different ways of doing things, and they were usually successful.
Well, Abe, it's obvious that you could go on and on. Is there just one more story or?
One more story. Puerto Rico. 3 couples of our church, Hal and I, brother and his wife, and another couple, we decided we'd go for a month to Puerto Rico to help rebuilding. My brother was fluent in Spanish. The other guy was partially fluent. And so we would work as a Moses and Aaron team. We were stationed at Aibonito and worked at Coamo, which is, as the crow flies, only 6 miles apart, but 12 miles by the road with 120 curves. So we worked there, and Tom came there at that time. And my brother wanted to go to Coamo to the deputy mayor for some things. Tom says, well, I don't have to go along. I said, Tom, you have told me, project director has authority, you come along. So he did. We walked into the office. There were people sitting there. Brother walked straight past all of them, greeting them slightly, walked into the deputy mayor's office and talked to them. Came back. We needed to know where a few places were, and we couldn't find them. So Henry, my brother, had persuaded the deputy mayor to come with us and show us. So now we were 4 in the car. And when he dropped off the mayor and we went home, Tom says to me, shaking his head, I've never seen something like this before. Here a guy walks past all the people and walks directly into the deputy mayor's office and talks with all the people. In a few minutes, he has them all sort of wrapped around his little finger, as it were. We worked there. Tom had told me, I want you to call me at least once a week. Well, Aibonito, we lived in a place where anybody and everybody could hear part of the phone call. And I did not want that. So I asked the homeowner as good as I could whether I could use his phone. I'd pay him later. Yeah, use my phone whenever you want. Well, I did. And just before we went back, Tom says, phone me when you get home. Well, I figured, waiting in the airport, might as well call from the airport. So I called him from the airport, and he says, Abe, we have decided you and your brother are going back to Puerto Rico when the youth come. I said, have you got another joke? So we can laugh at 2 jokes. This is not a joke, he says. We're dead serious about this. We were there in March, I think, and used to come in June, July. Well, I say, now that I know what you expect, we'll talk about it and I'll let you know. Okay. So when we were home, my wife's brother said, you are not going for 2 months. We have our wedding anniversaries. I think it was the 50th wedding anniversary. You have to be home at least 2 weeks before that. So Henry and I went alone, and things went quite well with the youth. We had a guy there who came from the United States. His occupation was renovations, and he had worked in almost all continental states. A relatively young guy, but a divorcee. He and his wife had divorced. And when the youth groups were supposed to come, there was one leader. He would be there for 2 weeks because he had 2 youth groups coming. So the cook came to me and said, Abe, will you pray for me? I said, what about? Well, this guy that's here 2 weeks is like a steamroller. He thinks he can roll over. He has his way. I says, well, he might discover differently. I can be a brick wall. He won't necessarily run over everything. But he was also a divorcee. It just so happened that this guy, when on the first project that he was on, comes home in the evening. He's lost his wallet. I said, oh, where'd you lose it? Well, the last I had it was at the place where we started working in my backpack. It may have fallen out there. Well, I says, it's getting dark soon. Let's hop into the vehicle and go there. So we went, and some of his youth, sort of sub-leaders, said, we want to go with. I said, fine, that's great. So we went there, drove on the yard, and walked up there, and he says, here's your wallet. Picked the wallet up there and gave it to him. Well, he says, it calls for ice cream celebration, and I'm paying the bill. And his guy said, you better pay the bill. So we were sitting around enjoying our ice cream, and he says, I have an idea. Tomorrow we are going to switch the various groups that we have, each to a different place. And one of his assistant leaders looks at him and says, and that's the last thing you will do. We've trained them to block today, and you're not taking them away. Too bad for you. So, okay, that sort of put down their foot a little bit. I didn't have to. But I had to make a phone call to Tom. So I phoned Tom and I said, Tom, has MDS become a haven for divorcees? He was quiet for a little bit and he says, respond, rebuild, restore. Not limited to buildings. Thank you. That's all I need to know. Once, West Virginia, I was sent there to take on a project that had been going there for a while already. I said to them, I need to know 3 things. Who are the cooks? Because that's a very important part. Who's the construction foreman? And it's actually mainly those 2. Well, it says cooks are John and Margaret Platts from Steinbach, Manitoba. I said, oh, I know them. No problem. And construction foreman, Alan. I says, Alan who? Is that the same guy that was in Puerto Rico? Yes. Oh, good, I said. I have no problems. Alan comes up to me, shakes my hand and says, oh, am I glad to see you. I says, that feeling is mutual. How do you want to run this project? Barely set my foot on the ground. Says, I'd have not a clue. I first have to see what's going on. Well, next morning at 6 o'clock, he was in my office. How are you going to run the project? Says, I don't know. But there's an agreement that we have to make between us. I will not accept any project where we're going to work on before I've talked to you, and you promise none before you've talked to me. That's a deal. I'll do the practical, you do the political. Okay, fine. Wonderful experience we had there.
Well, Abe, it's obvious that you have been working with and invested in MDS for much of your life. And the stories could, as I say, just go on and on. But thank you so much for taking the time to give us especially some of that early history and some of the stories of the experiences you've had. And what a small world it is in some ways. We finally got this done, and I thank you so much.
I spent many a waking hour at night thinking of what to say, and I maybe have left something out, but I think there's enough.
This has been wonderful. Thank you again for taking the time. And I'm sorry about your sleepless nights, but finally we're able to get the technology to work so we could make this recording.
Thank you very much, Gloria.
All right. Take good care.